You're listening to Rock, Pop, and Roll.
Welcome into Rock, Pop, and Roll, the podcast, episode number 24. This episode, it's all about Jackson Browne. Jackson Browne in the 1980s, rating his singles and rating his decade. How was Jackson Browne really in the 1980s? Really, how was he? Well, let's revisit that because there's some good stuff and there's some other stuff on Rock, Pop, and Roll. As we go along, we'll rate the singles. We did this with Elton John back in when we rated his 80s singles in a past podcast. And it's just fun to do on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not as good, 10 being can't do any better. First, a little Jackson Browne history. Jackson Browne co-wrote several songs for the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. He was a member of that band in 1966 before they were signed. He then co-wrote the hit Take It Easy for the Eagles, their first top 40 hit back in 72. Jackson Browne then released his debut album the same year. It had one top 40 hit, Dr. My Eyes, went to number 8, and he had another that should have been a hit, only got up to number 48, Rock Me on the Water.
While the fires are raging hotter and hotter, but the sisters of the sun are gonna rock me on the water now. Rock me on the water, sister, will you soothe my fever brow?
Jackson Browne, he had the lyrics, he had that LA sound. It just evolved into something that was a little more radio friendly, but this was, FM stations played Jackson Browne all the time. His second album was called For Every Man. His third album, Late for Sky, was his most successful to that point. It peaked at number 14 on the Billboard 200 album chart. Got him a Grammy nomination for Album of the Year with Late for Sky. It was Jackson's fourth album, The Pretender, and that was produced by Jon Landau. John later still is the longtime manager of Bruce Springsteen. That album, The Pretender, cracked the top 5 of the album charts. Got up to number 5. Had a hit single with Here Come Those Tears Again. Got up to number 23. And an FM hit. The album wasn't universally loved by critics, but I loved it a lot. I loved that title track.
Out into the cool of the evening strolls the pretender. He knows that all his hopes and dreams begin and end.
It's funny, that's the song I hear Springsteen in that. Produced by Landau. I love the strings, the majesty of the strings. Probably his early career signature song. That's Jackson Browne, The Pretender. 1977, he had an album running on empty that reached number 3. It was a live album and kind of something of a concept album, too. About life on the road, late 70s, those kind of songs. The album had 2 great top 40 singles, had Running on Empty, which went to number 10, and The Loadout / Stay got up to number 22, another of those tracks that became popular on the radio and on FM rock stations of the time. There was a third single that was released. It was a year after the album was out. They said, let's release another one. It only went to 109, so never even hit the Hot 100, but I love it a lot. From New Jersey in 77, You Love the Thunder.
You love the thunder.
I think I like that because I used to hear that driving down the highway, somehow close enough to Detroit to get the Detroit radio stations, and having this thing come on at like 11:30 at night. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. This is the Rock, Pop, and Roll podcast, episode 24, looking at Jackson Browne. Talk about his the band that played with him for his debut album and the next several albums and concert tours, he worked closely with a group of musicians they became known as The Section. Leland Sklar on bass, Russ Kunkel on drums, Danny Korchmar on guitar. He would later go on to produce like Don Henley's hit stuff in the late 80s. David Lindley was a multi-instrumentalist. Great addition, great sound that was always associated with Jackson Browne. Waddy Wachtel, the guitarist, played with them a lot. They played with a lot of Elektra Records bands and artists. They were on the Tapestry album with Carole King, and they did a lot of stuff with James Taylor, did a lot of stuff with Linda Ronstadt, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. The Section. So that's what kind of gave Jackson Browne his 70s sound. Thanks for listening. I'm Rob Nichols. We talk rock and roll and pop music from the playlist of the decade of the 1980s. Directly from the heartland is where this microphone is set up and recording digitally. We are in the middle of Indiana. Thanks for tuning in to kick off the decade of the 80s for Jackson Browne. He had a couple killer hit radio singles. It started off with Loud and Proud, right? 1980s album Holdout only had 7 songs on it. But this is did you know this part about Jackson Browne? That was his only #1 album of his career, 1980s Holdout. Not a critical favorite, but did have a killer single.
You know the kids in shock up and down the block. The folks are home playing Beat the Clock.
That is great production. Loud drums, guitar.
Down at the Golden Cup, they set the young ones up under the knee.
Jackson said, this is a song about runaways. It's about runaways. It's about the Hollywood Boulevard. Another single, underrated, that came out off that album called That Girl Could Sing. Got up to number 22. So that got his 1980s underway. Kind of understated, underrated with that. I remember playing that when I was on the radio. Kind of sneaking that thing in. Not necessarily on the playlist. In 1982, Jackson had his hit single that wasn't on an album. Went to number 7 on the top 40 charts. It was number 4 on mainstream rock radio. Used in the film Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Do you remember this one? Kind of if you listen to it, it's a little bit of his yacht rock contribution, but catchy as hell.
I heard her talking with her friend when she thought nobody else was around.
Little keyboards.
She said she's got to be somebody's babe.
There's radio ear candy.
Cause when the cars and the signs and the streetlights light up the town, she's got.
So that led into 1983's album Lawyers in Love, which was his kind of where he and MTV converged for just a bit. Jackson Browne had a top 10 album with that. It was his first album without David Lindley since his debut. They made it at a warehouse in downtown LA. They just turned it into a studio. The title track was all over MTV. It was a top 20 hit, comfortably in the top 20, went up to number 13.
And the strangled cries of lawyers in love.
It's number 4 on rock radio. So this was all over the place if you were paying attention in the 80s.
God sends his spaceships to America, the beautiful. They land at 6 o'clock.
So if you think about it, Lawyers in Love has some hints of his 1980s political work, how he would become more political. Rick Vito played guitar on this album. He was the guy who played slide guitar on Bob Seger's song Like a Rock. He was in Fleetwood Mac for a time in the 1990s. Russ Kunkel from The Section played drums on that album. The second single went to number 25. Only went to number 18 on the rock radio chart. I thought that was a bigger hit. I mean, stats don't lie, right? I still like this one. By the way, I give Lawyers in Love a 6 on the scale of 1 to 10. Somebody's Baby's a 7.5. That Girl Could Sing's a 7. Go back to Boulevard. That's a 7. I give this one an 8. I do. Tender of the Night.
And in the heart light of an said or done.
I think I like the big drum.
Tender are the words they choose. You win, I win, we lose.
See, that's so underrated. I like that. Third single, Rolling Stone said of the third single, it was Jackson Browne's attempt to emulate Bruce Springsteen's work. He said the song was written as a tribute to James Honeyman Scott, the guitar player of the Pretenders, who had died of heart failure in 1982. He was just 25 years old. This is an 8. I do like this song from that album, the third single, for a rocker.
A party tonight for a rocker.
So that went to 45 on the Hot 100. It was number 7 on rock radio. They attempted a fourth single. Rock radio didn't even really embrace it. It was not on the top 40.
I wish I could cut it away. This crazy longing for something more. Cut it away. The question I don't have an answer.
I don't remember that one so much. And that's what the charts would tell me. That's his 83 Lawyers in Love album. 4 singles from it. They milked that thing, didn't they, baby? Hey, this is rock, pop, and roll, the 1980s output of Jackson Browne. So he went from that to probably the apex of his MTV, of his singles career. Not necessarily his artistic peak, mind you. I'm a Springsteen fan. Come on. I love Clarence Clemons. But you're a friend of mine, Jackson Browne and Clarence Clemons from the E Street Band. That couldn't be any bigger on radio back then for them. It was a top 20 hit, number 18, but it seemed like it was everywhere. The video was everywhere. The sax solo was everywhere. It was released actually on Clarence's solo album, in an album called Hero. But man, kind of lightweight pop song that was all over the place. Yeah, Clarence couldn't have been any bigger at the time, coming off the Born in the USA tour. It was fun. He was at the height of his celebrity. He dragged Jackson Browne along.
And you can't call on me until the day you die. Years may come and go. Here's one thing I know. All my life, you're a friend of mine.
That's kind of the end of Jackson Browne's golden top 40 era. Blow that thing, big man. So he had released, what did I give that song, by the way? What's that, a 4.5? I wrote in my notes, 4.5, that seems right. It's rock, pop, and roll. I'm Rob. Thanks for tuning to us, however you may be getting us, wherever you may be subscribing. You can do it everywhere. Thanks. 1986, so he went from 83 to that single to 1986. Jackson Browne released Lives in the Balance. Political, socially more, trying to make a statement, right? Socially critical songs. First single was called a little heavy-handed, coming off of the Clarence Clemons kind of throwaway, you're a friend of mine, kind of heavy-handed, but it did, there was still momentum for Jackson Browne. It was a number 3 rock radio song, number 30 in the top 40. This was his last top 40 hit.
I prayed for America. I was made for America. It's in my blood and in my bones.
So For America, his last top 40 hit. I wouldn't have guessed that. He followed that up with a song. This one did not even make the top 40. It surprises me. It was a hit on rock radio. It was an adult contemporary hit back when they had adult contemporary stations playing Air Supply and such. The Carpenters. Somehow this one fit in and better than that. But did, 3 different formats did play it, rock, pop, and AC. Stan Lynch from the Heartbreakers plays drums on this thing.
Never know what breaches and faults are concealed in the shape of a heart. shape of a heart.
Maybe in his catalog, that thing's the most underappreciated song of all. I mean, that's a good tune. I mean, it's clean, it was smooth, but something about that, I like it. Kind of heavy lyrics. It was about the relationship he had with his first wife. She died of a drug overdose in 1976. Rolling Stone calls this one of his greatest, finest, I think was the word they used, love songs. Great lines at the end. He sings, "It was a ruby that she wore on a stand beside the bed in the hour before dawn when I knew she was gone." Pretty damn good lyric. Sneaky damn good song too. Jackson Browne, I gave that thing an 8. A little trivia, the B-side of that single was a non-album track. Little Stevie Van Zant's Voice of America from Van Zant's 84 album of the same name. So no more top 40, though rock radio, which was in its heydays in the 80s, continued to embrace Jackson Browne. Lives in the Balance. That song was used in the show Miami Vice. And then he had another album in the 1980s. His final album of the 80s was called World in Motion. Not a top 40 hit, but rock and roll radio was still embracing it. Went to number 4, kind of just high from the momentum of being a new Jackson Browne song. It's the title cut, and I gave it a 3. Man, I was working at WORX in Little Madison, Indiana, and I played the heck out of it. We had the album, and you wanted to play Jackson Browne. You wanted to play him, right? I did. And I mean, that was a single, and that was about the best. I gave it a 3. He had another single that was number 9 on the rock radio chart. I gave it a 3 as well, Chasing You Into the Light. I don't even remember this one being played on the radio.
Morning comes hard and bright, and I'm exhausted from running after you all night. Chasing you into the light.
I mean, I can tell you if I remembered it. And I remembered everything and listened to everything I could in that genre. That's why we're doing a podcast, right? And somewhere there's just a black hole where this song did not exist in my realm of living. Like that little guitar break in it, though. You're listening to Rock, Pop, and Roll. And that's it. That's the output of the 1980s of Jackson Browne. I do want to give you one more, though, in 1990, because he had one last gasp where he kind of got a little love from radio. I'm Alive in 93. The title track only went up to 118 on the charts, so it didn't even make the Hot 100. Rock radio was still playing him. Got up to number 18 in 93 with the title track to I'm Alive.
Those dreams are dead, and I'm alive.
I mean, it sounds like Jackson Browne, right? I give that thing a 5. I'm Alive. This is Rock, Pop, and Roll, the podcast. Jackson Browne was one of the singer-songwriters that bridged that 1960s, early 1970s socially conscious singer-songwriter, bridged that with the days of album-oriented rock and guitars and loud drums and rock and roll that ruled a lot of radio in the 1980s. His 70s output kind of underplayed on classic rock radio anymore. They only skim the same few, it seems like. You've heard me talk that before, but man, it drives me nuts that classic rock stations, such a narrow playlist and so many classic rock tunes that we heard growing up, or, people in the 80s and 90s heard these songs when they were newer, and somehow a lot of them have fallen off those playlists, and a lot of Jackson Browne's songs have fallen off for getting a lot of his catalog. I mean, his 1972 debut album, Saturate Before Using, it had Rock Me in the Water, it had Doctor My Eyes on it. I mean, a smart rock and roll catalog. And smart. He's still around, man. He helped organize musicians for Safe Energy, and they played the two nights that became the No Nukes concert in 1979 in New York City. Petty was there, Bonnie Raitt among many others. And those were the shows that Bruce Springsteen played an abbreviated 90-minute set at those, closing both. There was 2 shows, closed both nights. He finally released the video in 2021, his songs from those nights, and that's probably his greatest live video release ever, just at the height of Bruce Springsteen's power. So Jackson Browne, he put that together. We wouldn't have that Springsteen set, that live video now that is so spectacular. If you haven't seen it, just at least look at the previews. You can buy it or rent it online. But his 79 show there was great. Jackson Browne, one of the integral people to put that together. His 90s output turned a little more political, not as rock pop radio friendly, but he keeps making albums, does Jackson Browne. I saw him on tour when he was doing a solo tour. This was in the 90s. He was just surrounded by a bunch of instruments. He did all the good stuff. I mean, he did Rock Me, he did Doctor, he did The Pretender. His Lawyers in Love stuff, damn good. I loved it. Just in a theater. So Jackson Browne, now he's an elder statesman, right? Springsteen inducted him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 2004. Jackson Browne's a Steinbeck Award winner for his environmental causes. He's likely played thousands of benefit concerts in his career. And his output was pretty regular for a long time after all these albums we talked about, a couple of albums every decade and some live shows. So he had I'm Alive in 93, an album in 96 called Looking East. He released a 2002 album, Naked Ride Home, a 2008 album, Time the Conqueror, 2014, Standing in the Breach, and then in 2021, Jackson Browne recently released Downhill from Everywhere. Released in the summer of 2021, his first album of new material in 7 years. And cracked, for what it's worth, cracked the hot one, into the top 100 of the album chart. Went up to number 86, whatever that's worth, right? Jackson Browne, he's one of those musicians that we kind of take for granted, maybe dismiss his, when his thoughts and his causes might differ from ours politically or socially. Not that I'm that much different from Jackson Browne, but you know, he'll take a stand, and that doesn't make him any less great. He's a rock guy who makes great effort to be an artist. He's done it for more than 50 years. He followed his heart, his beliefs, his art. Jackson Browne is important to telling the story of a rock and roll. He evolved. He rocked. He wrote songs that mean something.
Subscribe to Rock, Pop, and Roll wherever you get your podcast, and find all the episodes at rockpopandroll.com.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Hang on for one last fact. You gotta hang on. Fact and a tune. You can subscribe to Rock, Pop, and Roll, as Brad just told you. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Stitcher, wherever you do get your podcast. Find us on Twitter. You can at 80's Rock, Pop, Roll. Email us, rockpoprollpodcast@gmail.com. If there's an episode, an artist that you have an idea for, let us know. That's how the germ of this podcast, the idea came from the great Dan Vonderheide. Thanks, Dan. One of my radio friends. You can find me on Instagram at RockRob. And if you like the show, share it with somebody. Share it with a fan of 80s pop and rock and roll. Please do that. Please. Not going to beg, but makes us happy when we know a new listener has found us. And thanks for listening to the many podcasts that we've done. Go back and listen to anything you want to, right? The episode on Huey Lewis, we got a Kool and the Gang. Great power pop tunes. This is the one we did recently. So go back and find our catalog. Hey, we want to give you a recommendation as well. Every once in a while, we run into a show that we just love and can't get enough of. And I do want to recommend a show. It's a show, right? What is it, actually? You can find it on Instagram. It's the Pat Finnerty Show. Find him on Instagram. He's a Philadelphia musician. Has his own band, just kind of at the local at that level, local, but Philadelphia, right? Huge city. He leads the Tom Petty Appreciation Band. He's on YouTube. He does a thing called Why This Song Stinks, and they're brilliant. He started doing Instagram Live every night when the pandemic started. It was kind of his way to stay sane, and he would talk to people. If he's famous for doing a Grohl-a-thon where he stayed on Instagram Live for 24 hours until he got Dave Grohl. Maybe he did think he was going to. I think he did think he was going to, and he did. He got Grohl. So Pat Finnerty Show. Look for him on Instagram. Would be a great place to start, and you can find him on YouTube and dig into him because he's funny as hell, and he likes a lot. He picks up a guitar and can play anything, man. It's just worth listening to, watching. If you like what we're doing, I think you'd like what he's doing. So we end with one last fact, a song to get us out of here as well. Jackson Browne's 15th studio album is called Downhill From Everywhere, released in the summer of 2021. And Jackson Browne, let's play you out with one of the songs from that album, shall we? Jackson Browne, he's an artist, follows his heart with his head intact. That's what I wrote. He's one of the great writers and players of rock and roll in the 70s and 80s. And the cut to play us out, this is called Still Looking for Something. Aren't we all?
Still looking for something. I'm out here under the neon. Still looking for something tonight.
Hey, thanks for listening. I will see you next time.
You don't get something for nothing.
Be good to each other. I'm Rob.
Without a fight. If I don't find it this time, it's alright. Gonna keep my options open, even though I'm hoping for something I can hold up to the light. Don't know that I'll find it, or this hopeful smile behind it. If all I find is freedom, it's alright.
You're listening to Rock, Pop, and Roll.